So here we go, rising from the dead. We thought that inflation was this thing that we battled to the ground, wrestled to the ground, as one of our prime ministers famously said. But now it rises again. So what's going on here? How do we understand it, and what does it mean? Here is the long-run view on inflation in Canada using one of the measures, the most common measure, which is the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. I think most of you are pretty familiar with that. And you see that it's had its ups and downs over the long history. So in a way, we got to have a bit of historical perspective, not to minimize what's happening now, but just think, you know what, we've kind of seen this kind of thing before at different moments in history, and it doesn't mean the world is about to come to an end. So of course, we have this surge in inflation now. We've been used to inflation of around 2%. As we reopened after the pandemic, and we'll talk about what was happening there, it has increased over the last several months and is now running at a year-over-year rate of 5.5%. Now, what that year-over-year means is comparing prices today to prices a year ago, they're 5.5% higher on average. So, I think most of us understand what inflation is. It means the overall level of prices across the economy is rising. Of course, we're used to things changing in price. They do all the time. Things go on sale. Some things become more expensive when they're very popular. Some things become cheaper when technology allows it to be produced more efficiently, or when companies are desperate to sell and they cut their price. But inflation is something different, where you're seeing the overall level of prices increase. Lots of different ways to measure it, of course, and I think it's important to have a bit of sort of statistical understanding on the different measures of inflation, because sometimes you can zero in on one and it doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story. The Consumer Price Index is the most common one. That measures the average increase in the weighted basket of all of the things that consumers buy, not just products in a store, but also services, and even things like what you pay for your living arrangements or your transportation, all bundled together, weighted according to how much Canadians spend on each item or each category, and then gives an overall measure of the rate of price increase. All kinds of tweaks that can be made to the measure to adjust to try and, in a way, downplay some of the noise in inflation, kind of some of the temporary ups and downs. So we'll talk about that a little bit. But there's other measures of inflation that are also important. One is the CPI measures what we pay as human beings when we go out and buy what we need to survive. The producer price index concept is a way of measuring what do businesses pay for the different inputs to their businesses. And this is an important thing to keep an eye on. What do you pay for different industrial products? What do they pay for various raw materials? Another measure of inflation, the broadest measure really, is called the GDP Deflator. This is a weighted average of the level of the rate of price change of everything that's produced or purchased in the whole economy. So in a way, it's the broadest indicator. And we get slightly different views depending on what we're looking at. So here's the Consumer Price Index. This is the year-over-year change since February. February is the most recent data we have. So compare February 2022 to February 2021. As I mentioned, the overall price index is going up about 5.5%, but very different rates of increase for different things within the bundle. So you'll see that the prices of goods have risen much faster than the prices of services, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then all of the other different categories. We know what the big ones are. The big ones, of course, are gasoline and energy prices more generally, but especially gasoline, $2 a liter. We saw, for those of us who haven't bought a Tesla or another electric vehicle yet, we're very aware of what that meant. Housing prices, of course, have shot up. Some groceries have shot up, meat in particular. Those are all rising at double-digit levels at this point in time. Other things have been rising more gradually. Clothing, for example, there's hardly been any increase in the prices of clothing. So the overall CPI, that 5.5% number, is the weighted average of all of those things. And then, as I mentioned, they sometimes like to adjust these in order to kind of step back from some of the momentary fluctuations. So this shows you some of the different ways to make those adjustments. The black line is the basic CPI that we've been talking about. The blue line is a measure that the Bank of Canada creates that pulls out 8 of the most volatile items, including some energy prices, in order to get what they think is a better measure of the sort of core momentum in prices. Statistics Canada does a couple of other approaches, a weighted median and a trimmed mean. If you were a real nerd, you could just dive right into the spreadsheet and explore all these differences. The key takeaway here is that the CPI has been driven up particularly by some enormous price increases in a few commodities, particularly energy, housing, and some groceries. And if we step back from that, then the overall problem of inflation doesn't look as bad. And some of those prices, particularly energy, are going to come down. However, in a way, it's a bit of cold comfort because you see that all of those lines, it doesn't matter what color it is, all of those lines are increasing. So it's no longer a situation where we can purely just blame the oil price for what's going on. There is a phenomenon that's becoming more broadly based in the economy of rising prices, and that's important to know. For businesses, the problem is actually worse, to tell you the truth, than it is for consumers. The prices of various producer products that are purchased, inputs, including industrial goods or raw materials, have grown much faster than consumer prices. So in a way, this is another sign that the problem could get worse before it gets better, because those businesses are paying higher prices for inputs, and they are likely to try to pass them along in the form of higher prices on their products in the future. The other one that I mentioned was the GDP deflator. This is a measure of the overall prices of what's produced and bought in the whole economy, and then broken down into different categories. They do have their own consumption deflator that they use in this area, and it is not quite as dramatic as the increase in the CPI. The overall increase in prices across the economy has been very higher than the CPI, partly because of the big increases in oil prices over the last year. Oil is a part of Canada's economy. It doesn't drive Canada's economy, but the amount of oil, when the oil price shoots up as it has, can lift up the overall level of prices in the economy as a whole. And that's why that total increase in the GDP deflator looks so much stronger. So a number of different ways to get at it, but the takeaway is inflation has increased significantly in the last year, and to the highest levels in the last 30 years, but not unprecedented. And it is broadly based at this stage, what we're seeing. It isn't limited to just a couple of key commodities. Now, inflation has its pluses and its minuses, and we end up hearing a lot of rhetoric about how inflation is going to mean the end of us and the greatest challenge that we face. And that's, again, that's not the sort of perspective that is informative, and certainly not the sort of perspective that is going to help us as trade unionists to imagine what is the best way out of this. The good, the bad, and the ugly, if you like. I can't stand to see Clint Eastwood there as the good anymore, ever since he started talking to the chair and doing all those other nut bar things. But that's still the movie. The good, the bad, and the ugly. So there are actually benefits from inflation. Economists, even mainstream economists, have figured out it's better to have some inflation than no inflation. Because if the overall level of prices is growing, then some of the things that have to get cheaper over time can become cheaper over time, but without actually having to cut their prices in nominal dollar terms. So mainstream economists agree that a certain level of inflation, they have a disagreement over what that level should be. Typically, they say around 2%, but some inflation is needed just to kind of grease the wheels of the price changes that happen over time. Also, when inflation is occurring, it means that the real burden of debt, if you owe money, is going to shrink basically over time, because the real dollars that you're going to pay back in the future when you pay back that loan or that mortgage are in a way not worth as much as they are worth today. By contrast, if prices are falling, then the real burdens of debt expands and explodes. And this is why the problem of deflation, which is falling prices, is such a disaster for the economy, because it creates a total debt crisis. When prices are rising, you're basically shifting wealth from lenders the rich people and the banks who lent the money, and you're shifting wealth to the borrowers because they don't have to pay back as much in real terms. You're also having important impacts on government finances, and we're going to see that in about 1 hour when the federal finance minister stands up to deliver her budget, because the government is going to be awash in money because of inflation. Government expenses go up because of inflation, but government revenues go up even faster because of inflation. So you're getting more revenues, and then you're reducing the real value of government debt and government deficits. So there are some pluses to this. I'm not saying that we should just let inflation rip, but we should keep in mind the costs and benefits, and in a way so that we don't get talked into a false sense of panic about how bad this is. The bad things about inflation, of course, if your wages are not keeping up, and that's an important if, inflation can be bad. It means the real purchasing power of your incomes are shrinking, and that means your real standard of living is going to decline. Now, that doesn't necessarily happen. We've had times where inflation was high, but wages did keep up. The 1970s, for example, inflation was much higher than it is now, but real wages were growing at a decent pace, 1.5% a year in the 1970s, above and beyond inflation. So the idea that we're going to go back to the bad old 1970s, we got to take with a grain of salt. For working people, the 70s weren't bad. Yes, there was inflation, but real wages were growing strongly, in part because unions were stronger and social programs were stronger. Similarly, of course, for anyone who's on a social benefit, whether that's a pension or provincial income supports or any other type of social benefit, your real standard of living will decline if your benefits don't keep up. Now, in Canada, our federal social benefits have been indexed to inflation, and this is a very important thing and very positive. So your CPP benefit or your OAS benefit is not going to be hurt by inflation because it's going to automatically keep step. But other social benefits, especially those at the provincial level, are not indexed. And then you're taking away from some of the poorest people in society with inflation. And you have to acknowledge as well that there's just a certain amount of stress and uncertainty that's caused when prices are rising. And this is what I think many people are experiencing now. And what some of the right-wing drum beaters like Pierre Poilievre are going to try and tap into. They have a sense that people are worried about this, and they're going to come out with their own agenda. And we can't deny that there's stress and uncertainty caused by inflation. We just have to make sure we don't get railroaded down a path of right-wing policies that are going to be more painful and damaging than the disease. The ugly, of course, is this great stereotype and this great gobbledygook boogeyman that's invoked, which is if inflation gets out of control, we're all going to have, we're going to be pushing wheelbarrows of worthless money around the street and have a complete social breakdown. And of course, that can happen. It has happened a small number of times in history, whether it was the Weimar Republic in Germany or Zimbabwe. The reality is there are many differences between Canada and Zimbabwe, not least being the weather and the wildlife, but mostly being a question of political and institutional stability and democracy. And so this hyperinflation nonsense we can just throw out. There's no credibility for the argument that if we don't crush inflation now, we're going to end up like Zimbabwe. We have had a system in Canada over the last 3 decades where the Bank of Canada, which is the government's central bank, it oversees interest rates in the banking system, has one core task, one core function that it's been given, which is to keep inflation around 2%, plus or minus 1%. So they have a band. They're supposed to keep it between 1% and 3%, average 2% in the long run. And they use ups and downs of interest rates and sometimes other measures to try and keep inflation in that 1 to 3% band. Now, you can say that it worked. It certainly did work. We had a brutal recession in the early 1990s that was the result of the introduction of this system to bring inflation down from 5% to 2%. And an enormous cost, including to governments, because of the reverse impact, what I just described. If inflation is falling and the economy is in recession, then government deficits get really bad, especially when interest rates are high, as they were. So it was a success if you only cared about the inflation rate, but we also care about all the other indicators that we have. This Bank of Canada system itself really, in a way, has some limits, and I think it's been given more credit for lower inflation than it deserves. There were lots of other things happening in this period, not the least being the flood of cheap imports from China that also drove down average consumer prices. And some of the theoretical work in recent years has really highlighted that the inflation targeting is not all it's cracked up to be. And the Bank of Canada knows it actually, and they've actually operated more flexibly, particularly in the decade since the global financial crisis, than the strict reading of the inflation targeting regime would have you suggest. And it is very important to note that we've had many, 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 many times when inflation was below the Bank of Canada's target. In fact, if you go back to 1992, the Bank of Canada fell below 2% 279 times, and above it 70 times. And they equaled it once. There was 1 month in that whole period where they were bang on 2%. Now, that's kind of just silly because they never expected to be bang on 2%. But anyways, the key thing is the times that they missed, 80% of the time they missed below. That is, inflation was too low, even by their own standards. By their own standards, 2% is the ideal inflation. So if you're worried about inflation not being 2%, it's symmetrical. You should be just as worried when inflation is too low as you are when it's too high, if you believe that 2% inflation and expectations of 2% inflation are such a wonderful magnet for an efficient economy. In terms of shooting right outside that band, remember that +1 and -1 band, they fell below 1% 41 times. They rose above 3% 16 times. So 72% of the time they were missing the band. They were missing it below, not above. So there's been an anti-inflation bias. It's not just 2%. They've been aiming for lower than 2%. And on average, over this whole period, the average rate of inflation in Canada was about 1.5%, not 2%. So we have to keep this history in mind when everyone's going nuts about missing the band from above, as it is right now. In fact, if you went back to 2010 and you looked at what the price level was then, and then you increased it, you inflated it at a steady 2% a year, assuming that the bank was hitting its target, prices would be much higher today than they are, even with the recent surge in inflation above the 3% upper limit of the Bank of Canada's band. So this again is a bit of perspective, a bit of historical perspective. Again, not to say inflation doesn't matter, just to keep in mind the history and the need for some symmetry. Pierre Poilievre was never out banging the drum saying the Bank of Canada should be shut down and we should let the monetary system be run by cryptocurrency innovators when the rate of inflation was below the Bank of Canada's target. Okay, so he's not really concerned about hitting the Bank of Canada's target. He's concerned about something else, which is called suppressing wages, suppressing government services, and cutting taxes and deregulating the financial system. That's his agenda, not protect the standard of living of Canadians. So the current surge in inflation is obviously an impact, consequence of the COVID pandemic. Initially, prices fell during the first lockdowns because people couldn't go out shopping. You had to stay home. Businesses had to close. There was enormous uncertainty. And there was a collapse in world petroleum prices. Remember, for a little while, the price of oil was actually negative. I know that sounds bizarre. It's the result of how oil futures markets work. But the price of oil was negative for a couple of months in the spring of 2020. And that caused actually a decline in average prices. Then you saw, as the economy reopened and people got back to spending and businesses reopened, but we had all kinds of problems with supply chains and so on, that's when prices began to take off after we started to reopening. Several factors that we can identify as causing the current upsurge in inflation to that 5% in some level that we're at right now. Number one, because of the shutdowns in the lockdown period, the amount of goods and services we produced fell a lot for a while. It rebounded very quickly, but for a while it fell a lot. Income did not fall, solely because the government jumped in with these enormous supports, including the SERB and all of the other programs that were given to support incomes during the pandemic. So you did not see a decline in income, but you saw a big decline in output, which meant that the money that was there to spend was no longer matched by goods and services that could be purchased. Secondly, a related point, consumers, once they did start spending again, shifted their demand to more products, more tangible goods, and less services, for the obvious reason that many of the services were still restricted. Eating out in restaurants, travel, and other services faced greater restrictions. So instead, people said, I'm going to renovate the house. And they went to Canadian Tire and bought up all the lumber. Okay, so that shift in demand from goods to services. Another factor related, consumers could not go out and buy the normal things that they did for several months. So then when things did reopen, then they went out and spent in a big way. And that pent up demand, financed through the money that people saved during the pandemic, also added to the surge in prices. We had lots of disruptions in supply chains and industries to supply goods and services at home and abroad because of travel restrictions and other things that went wrong. A big factor in our inflation in Canada has been the housing price bubble. Real estate has risen 30% in the last year. And there's a number of things there. One is the record low interest rates, which allows people to pay more for a house with borrowed money. The banks are happy to lend you that money. And on top of that, you've had a whole speculative dynamic happening with more and more properties being purchased by investors who don't plan to live in it. They're just trying to make money off of the flip. And finally, in the last 8 months or so, and particularly since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, we've had a global energy price shock. So some very interesting, powerful, worrisome things happening here. Some of them are side effects of good. Okay, the fact that output fell more than income is a good thing. Here's a graph that shows you that. Here's what was happening to disposable income in red versus our real GDP in blue. Excuse me. So you see that blue drop. Well, our real GDP fell by 13% in the worst period of the pandemic lockdowns. That was the worst downturn since the Depression. Now, luckily, it rebounded quickly. Why did it rebound quickly? Not because of the magic of the free market. It rebounded quickly because of that red line. The government spent hundreds of billions of dollars on CERB and other income supports, the wage subsidy to keep people employed, even if they weren't needed on the job. In fact, household income went up during the pandemic. That seems bizarre, okay? And you could argue, did the government go too far? Did the government overshoot with this? We can't say that because we don't know what would have happened to the economy if they hadn't done those big injections of income and spending power. So you had an increase in income at a time of falling output. And at first, people couldn't go out in the shop anyway, so we didn't get inflation. But when they could go out and shop, they had money to spend, thanks to those government programs. And it doesn't mean government caused the whole problem. In fact, government made the situation much, much better. If income had fallen, if the red line had fallen as much as the blue line, okay, we might not have as inflation today. We'd have a depression, and that's much, much worse. Because the incomes rose and people couldn't go out and spend, we had a very weird surge in household savings. And so you saw, typically Canadians actually don't save that much. Our savings rate for personal finances is quite low. But we had a huge surge in savings during the worst of the pandemic because we had income supports to protect our income, but we couldn't go out and shop. That has come down, but it's still not back to normal. Canadians are still saving more than they normally do, which suggests that there's still more to run in terms of the boom in consumer spending that could be ahead of us. Which is important to note. Now, this is the aggregate number of savings. Of course, not everybody saved. So the hardest hit Canadians and people who are low income to start with are not represented on this graph. And so we can't look at this and say Canadians, just got fat on all this government handouts. That is not true for everyone. There's a distributional factor here that we have to keep in mind. Then I mentioned this shift in demand from services to goods. The red and blue lines show the pattern in goods and services up to the pandemic. Both goods and services demand fell dramatically in the first months of the pandemic, but then when things could open up again, there was a big redirection of spending to the goods side rather than services. In fact, the services demand has really only now just caught back to where it was when the pandemic started. Whereas goods consumption is much, much higher. And that has complicated the inflation situation because it means demand for goods products is very high. I just have to wave my arms for a minute here, Stefan, because I have very politically correct energy efficient lights here in my office that go out if I sit on my ass for too long. So anyways, this is the difference in prices between goods and services. Overall inflation twice as high for goods as it is for services. So this is part of the story. You know, is this a good thing or a bad thing? It's just something that happened. It is a side effect of a terrible catastrophe. But the fact that consumers have money to spend on anything is good, not bad. What's going to happen now? Well, some of the factors behind this surge in inflation are transitory. Energy prices are already coming down from where they were a month ago, and we'll see them come down some more. So we'll see some heat come out of that CPI number the next couple of months. And some of those supply chain and demand recomposition effects are going to work themselves out. So to some extent, there is a transitory component to what's happened. On the other hand, we are not through with this pandemic. And I don't know if anyone noticed, they shut down the entire city of Shanghai about a week ago. And there's all kinds of stuff that's going to happen in terms of world trade and semiconductors and all kinds of other specialized products that are still going to be disrupted because of this pandemic. So that's still happening. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen with the war in the Ukraine, with OPEC's decisions and the price of oil. And there is no doubt that some of this inflation is now getting baked in more broadly into the overall economy. And this is what causes the conventional economists to lose sleep at night. They think we're about to start a whole new wage price cycle rather than just a one-off shift in prices because of the pandemic. And this is where the resistance to our efforts as trade unionists to protect the wages of our members through higher wage increases, the resistance to that is going to be very fierce, because that conventional mindset is going to say that will just lock in the wage price spiral forever and we'll be back in the 1970s. That's the argument we're against. I'm not accepting that argument, but that's the argument we're against, and it's a powerful argument. What are high interest rates going to do? The Bank of Canada is already increasing it, and the financial markets think they're going to increase the interest rate a lot more. One thing they will do is they will take some of the steam out of the housing bubble, no doubt about that. So we're already seeing some declines in housing resale prices, but it's a double-edged sword, because the house price has a small impact on the CPI, but there's another element in the CPI which is called your mortgage servicing costs, which will actually increase. When interest rates rise, you're going to spend more on the interest component. So this is not going to have the housing price will come down, but it will not have an immediate dramatic impact on the CPI itself. High interest rates in Canada are going to have zero impact on energy costs. I would say high interest rates would have a negative impact on the supply chain disruptions because of the fact it's going to make investment by businesses more expensive. So they're going to be less likely to undertake the sorts of capital investments and infrastructure and logistics that's required to fix supply. We will get a higher dollar with higher interest rates, and we've already seen some of that. So to a very minuscule extent, you'll see a decline in import prices, but it is not a strong effect. What high interest rates are actually going to do, they're going to destroy jobs and destroy household spending. And, that is, they don't say it out loud very often, but that is how this works. Okay, this is exactly what high interest rate policy and inflation targeting is about. When the Bank of Canada says, we're going to get inflation back to 2% no matter what, this is what they mean. We're going to throw hundreds of thousands or millions of Canadians out of work in order to reduce aggregate demand in Canada's economy enough that people can't afford stuff and the prices will fall. That is actually what they mean. And we have to be aware as trade unionists, what is at stake if we allow them to follow that conventional recipe book. That is exactly what happened the last time they disinflated Canada's economy. In the 80s, when they took inflation from 10% to 5%, we had a decade of on and off recession, and we had real wages that declined. In the 90s, when we took inflation from 5% to 2%, we had another decade of on and off recession and real wages that went nowhere. And so we don't want that to happen again. And we have to be aware of the arguments and aware of what's at stake. I want to talk a little bit about the energy price component of it, because this is the biggest single factor. It's not the only factor, but it's the biggest single factor in what's going on with our CPI. And then we get all kinds of nonsense coming again from the Pierre Poilievres of the world about what's at stake here. Curiously enough, despite this horrible thing happening in Europe, the world supply of oil has not declined. Okay, so there has not been a supply disruption because of the war. Russia itself was a small net exporter of oil to the rest of the world, and those net exports haven't stopped. So it isn't a question of the war has somehow turned off the tap. That's not what's happening here. What is happening is the financial traders who run the futures markets and the other speculative casinos of the world have responded to that war and the uncertainty that comes with it to drive up the price for speculative reasons, not because of supply and demand. And this is what always happens. This is why the price fell to zero during the lockdowns, not because demand fell to zero. Demand fell, but it didn't fall that much. And the same goes for this shock. So this is the fact that we have put our energy system in the hands of a global, deregulated, financialized, speculative system explains why we're paying $2 a liter at the pump for energy that was made from oil that was pumped in Canada, not Ukraine, pumped in Canada months before the Russians invaded. Okay, so why are we paying $2 a liter for that? It's got nothing to do with the Ukraine. It's got everything to do with how we've organized our energy system. And by the way, somebody is making a killing out of this, okay? And it isn't Vladimir Putin. It is the energy companies who are making money hand over fist at this moment in time because of how we've set this up. So yes, energy costs are a big part of the consumer price problem, but we have to have a realistic understanding of why and how that's being felt. Let me cut to the chase, Stefan and Janet, before I run out of time on the wages and prices issue, because it's obviously critical and front of mind to people. Pre-pandemic, Canadians were getting real wage gains, not big ones, but small ones. We had relatively low unemployment. We had a trade union movement that's fought like hell to try and hold its power in the society, in the labor market, winning some battles, losing some, but on the whole, sort of holding our ground. And real wages were growing. That means nominal wages were growing a little faster than inflation, and inflation at that time was low, around 2%. In the early months of the pandemic, prices fell, remember. So that means we got a real wage increase. Now, we weren't celebrating because we were fearing for our lives. But the reality is our real purchasing power went up when those consumer prices fell. Now they have rebounded and then some. And so we now have a situation where nominal wage growth in most industries is well behind the current pace of inflation of 5.5%. So it's important to remember that first part of the pandemic when we're telling this story. Because if all we did was look at the current moment, we would forget what happened in the initial pandemic when prices fell. So we should have expected some kind of rebound in inflation once the economy reopened. And I think a better index in a way here is to look at the last 2 years rather than the last 1 year, because 2 years takes us back to February 2020 before the pandemic hit. The overall increase in prices over the last 2 years has been higher than normal, but not spectacularly high. The increase in wages over those 2 years has exceeded the increase in prices. So looking in the rear view mirror here, going back 2 years, our real wages have actually increased, but they're falling right now. And that's what the concern is and what we have to be ready for in coming months. So this is an interesting graph. This shows you some of the funny things that go on when you're calculating the average wage. This comes from the monthly labor force survey of households that Statistics Canada does. And the two circles show the level of real wages adjusted for inflation before the pandemic and after the pandemic. So initially, the real wage went up. That was partly because prices fell, as I said, and it was partly because of the disproportionate impact of the initial lockdowns on our labor market. The people who lost jobs first and the most jobs are people in low wage, part-time, often temporary jobs in retail, hospitality, and other services industries. Those are the things that got shut down completely. They weren't the yuppies who could keep working on their laptop from home. Okay, now because all of those low wage jobs disappeared, the average wage of the jobs that were left looked higher. So that explains that big increase of over $2 an hour in the real wage in the initial stages of the pandemic. That changed when the economy reopened. First of all those low wage people got hired back and then some. Secondly, consumer prices started picking up again. So try to ignore that big spike because that doesn't, in a way it was dramatic, but it doesn't tell you really what's happening. But at this point, real wages are falling, but they're still higher than they were when the pandemic started. The statisticians try to take account of that interesting composition effect that occurred during the pandemic with something called a fixed weighted index of wages. It doesn't do the whole trick. They try to say, what would wages have been if the makeup of the overall labor force had stayed the same rather than those big changes during the pandemic? Even by that measure, real wages are higher than they were at the outset of the pandemic. And that reflects a number of things. One of them is the shift in the composition of employment since the pandemic. Hospitality and retail and other low-wage service jobs have come back, but not fully. More people are working today than before the pandemic, but they have shifted to other industries that on average pay a little better. So that fact has actually helped to lift average wages as well. Now, that's not just to say, you know, I'm a happy, optimistic, glass half full kind of guy and we should not worry about it. We should worry about it, but we should have a good understanding of what we've managed to protect. Big question here, who started this problem? Who started this fight between wages and prices, and who's benefiting from it? Very, very important. There is not a shred of evidence that the surge in inflation has started in the labor market. It is not about wages. It has absolutely not been caused by the tight labor market and the so-called labor shortage and the demands of unions, not remotely. It has absolutely been caused by businesses that have taken advantage of the supply chain disruptions, taken advantage of the fact that consumers have pent-up demand and savings to spend, and jacked up their prices to take it to reflect that buying power. That is absolutely what's happening, and the evidence is overwhelming. This is data on wholesale margins and retail margins that Statistics Canada collects. It's very interesting data. The red one is the retail margins. Those shot up in the immediate months of the reopening after the lockdowns. Now it's the wholesale margins that are shooting up, both of them sooner and faster than the CPI. So it's business driving this, absolutely not workers. Another look at it is what Statistics Canada calls a net corporate surplus. This is only quarterly, so the most recent data we have is from the last part of 2021. But again, corporate profit margins up significantly, just as inflation was starting to take off. And when we get the numbers for the first quarter of this year in another few weeks, we'll see that even surge even higher. For workers, on the other hand, there has been no surge in the share of GDP. There's been no increase in unit labor costs beyond the normal pace of growth. This shows the labor share of GDP. So this is wages and salaries and fringe benefits as a share of total output. You see that spike there in the early part of the pandemic. Again, this is a funny one. This partly reflects the income supports from government, and particularly the wage subsidy. It also reflects the fact that nominal GDP, which is the denominator of this ratio, shrank because of the pandemic and the huge government subsidies. So ignore that spike. Labor's share of GDP has gone nowhere. It's about the same as it was before the pandemic. Let me conclude. So we've got a bit of time for questions and discussion. Yes, we should be concerned about inflation, but we have to be so on guard against the right-wingers like Poilievre, who are going to pull out the neoliberal hymn book and start singing from it again, calling for monetary and fiscal austerity of the sort that ruined lives in the 1980s and 1990s. So we can express concern about inflation, but we have to educate ourselves and our members and our neighbors that the answer to it is not cut back spending, raise interest rates, and throw hundreds of thousands or millions of Canadians out of work, because that is exactly what that traditional recipe is about. The government's aggressive response to COVID and all of those income support payments, in a way, allowed this inflation. Okay, there's no doubt about that. If people didn't have the money in their pockets to spend, prices could not be as high as they are. But the fact that they have money in their pockets to spend was the result of a positive and powerful response by government to an enormous emergency. The alternative, if they hadn't have done that, would be lower inflation today, no doubt about it, probably zero or maybe even below zero. But again, ruined lives and people who are thrown out of their homes. So we have to have that in mind while we think about the concrete causes of the current surge in inflation. It's got nothing to do with workers. It's got nothing to do with government printing money, okay? It's got everything to do with a national, global health emergency and government's appropriate response to it. And yeah, we're going to have some bumps and some adjustments coming out of it. If we actually want to try and bring down inflation to a reasonable level, we shouldn't try to bring it down to zero, and we have to keep in balance the costs and benefits of it. So it's not job one, okay, to bring down inflation. It's one priority among many. What should we do? Number one, well, we have to protect workers right now. Prices are growing higher than wages, and we got to make sure that our wages keep up. So that's got to be a big demand, especially in the public sector where you got some governments, Doug Ford, for example, in Ontario with his 1% wage cap. And I know we're in bargaining here in BC. We have to reject the idea that public sector workers, especially with what they did for us during the pandemic, are going to pay. We have to index social benefits to ensure that the poorest people in our society do not have their incomes whittled away. There are important things government can do directly to bring inflation down. Housing policy would be a good one, including rolling out faster, low-cost and affordable housing, non-market housing in particular, building houses that are not speculative assets, but actually a roof over people's heads. And that is the goal. So whether it's co-ops or public housing or community housing trusts or other non-market strategies, that would make a big difference. Public services are part of the CPI. So bringing childcare down to $10 a day is going to have a measurable impact in reducing inflation. So let's do that and do it for other public services like transit. On the energy side, the places that are suffering the least from the current speculative surge are places that accelerated the shift to renewable energy. I can tell you the futures market for sunshine, okay, hasn't changed at all since the Russians invaded Ukraine. It's still zero, okay? So that's one way to reduce the vulnerability to energy price shocks. If we feel that we should restrain or cool off some of the spending power that's ratifying higher prices, we shouldn't do it by throwing people out of work. We should do it by targeting taxes to those who can most afford it. That will reduce their spending power without undermining the standard of living of the rest of us. This argument that if we try to keep up with inflation, we're somehow going to lock it in. We have to be ready to resist it, because that is going to be a powerful argument for people who have that mindset from the 1980s and 1990s still in place. Workers did not cause this inflation, so asking for a wage increase to keep up with it is absolutely legitimate and necessary. If we say, oh no, okay, we'll sacrifice because we don't want to set off another inflationary spiral, what is going to happen? We are going to accept a one-time transfer of wealth and income to all of those companies that are profiting from this inflation. That means housing developers, oil companies, and Jim Pattison and the other billionaires that own grocery stores. Okay, we aren't prepared to do that, and we shouldn't, and we can't let it happen, because if we let it happen, they'll try it again. So we can negotiate, we can fight and win things that protect our wages, but recognize that the current surge in inflation could be a transitory response to an unprecedented catastrophe, the pandemic. And we can do things like COLA clauses and other creative approaches at the bargaining table that compensate our members for this surge in prices, while at the same time saying if inflation comes down, then that's good, and then we'll just have low, we can still protect and grow our real wages over time without setting off this fearsome wage price spiral that everyone is going to be afraid of. So there's a distributional struggle here behind those CPI numbers and the impact on wages. And right now, the oil companies, the grocery stores, and the property developers are the ones winning. And we can't let them do that at the expense of our members. So thank you very much, folks, for your attention.